Welcome back. Now I'd like you to take a moment and think about first world countries such as England, New Zealand, Norway or even Australia. What makes them attractive? They boast fantastic transport infrastructure, there are plenty of economic opportunities for both local and foreign nationals, and crime rates are relatively low, right? But here's the thing. Some South African expatriates living in these so-called perfect countries are choosing to return home. Now, since 2009, a reported 350 to 400,000 South Africans have chosen to come back to Mzansi despite all its social, political and even economic problems. What could be the reason? Well, here's what eNCA's contributor Mpho Lakaje found out.
It may have taken a while, but she's gradually settling in and finding her rhythm. Antoinette Stolkenkamp is back home in Johannesburg after spending 2.5 years abroad. She and her family left South Africa at the height of the COVID-19 pandemic when local businesses were shutting their doors.
We were running one of the biggest tennis academies in South Africa, and my husband got a good opportunity to go to Sweden and work for one of the top academies in the world. And with South Africa's restrictions, no sport was allowed. So the business basically was really taking strain.
Arriving in Stockholm, Sweden, life became as fantastic as initially expected. But then the reality of living away from the familiarity of home kicked in.
We missed our culture, our heritage, things like Heritage Day, you know, braaiing, everything we've known, everything that is us, we missed, and that pulled us home definitely. Our marriage actually started suffering because you're kind of just existing, you're not living a life, you're just existing in the mundane.
And on the 29th of September 2022, the Stolkenkamps packed up their bags and returned to Johannesburg. But theirs is not an isolated case. In 2018, Chantel Hendrickson and her family moved to New Zealand and later Australia.
We didn't leave the country because of the crime or the load shedding or things like that. We left the country because a golden opportunity was presented to my husband. Because my husband is a qualified electrician, so he qualified on a short-skilled list.
A thriving career coupled with efficiency in service delivery, life abroad was great. But there's always a catch.
I did feel homesick, especially in New Zealand when we just landed. I cried for the first 2 days because I missed, and I was missing my family, and it was hard.
But when the pandemic struck, the Hendricksons became disillusioned.
COVID had a role to play in us coming back to South Africa. They started making the vaccine mandatory.
Chantel Hendrickson and Antoinette Stolkenkamp are among thousands of South Africans who've returned in the last decade or so. There's even a social media group of people either coming back or contemplating to do so. With that said, our country's brain drain cannot be downplayed. According to the United Nations, over 900,000 South Africans currently live abroad.
It's people who are quite skilled who are going there. So it's your accountants, your engineers, and people in the medical healthcare sector, doctors, nurses. Unfortunately, South Africa is experiencing a number of problems. The government acknowledges that there is the triple challenge, which is poverty, unemployment, as well as inequality.
Even if some want to come back home, issues of tax add a layer of complication.
You also need to consider what's your intention. Are you just leaving for a couple of years? How much are you going to be earning? Is it employment income, or are you going to set up a business offshore? That's factors that you need to consider when you leave the country. If you didn't go through this process, yes, there's certainly a fear from a non-compliance perspective of returning to South Africa.
But of course, that's just half of the picture. While South Africa is, without a doubt, facing a mountain of challenges, it remains attractive to some of its expatriates and the global community at large. Just this year alone, aviation companies like Air Belgium, Emirates and United Airlines either launched new routes or expanded their operations here.
The global north gravitates towards SA. SA is an ideal area to invest in compared to other countries in the region. You will note that the country is quite favorable. The recent visit of the president to England, there were discussions around how SA is, an ideal place to do business. It's acknowledged.
Also, tourism numbers are up by 500,000, 3 times more than the same period last year. But most importantly, South Africans coming back home tend to discover that their money goes a long way here than it does abroad.
People will sit down, draw up comparisons looking at salaries, and assume that the rand equivalent in that country would get them what it would get them here in South Africa. And it would be a rude awakening when one gets overseas and they realize that their quality of life changes. They can't afford to drive the car that they were driving in South Africa. They can't afford to live the kind of life they were living here.
It is now up to the government, the private sector and ordinary South Africans to capitalize on South Africa's strengths to continue attracting or retaining skilled people. Mpho Lakaje, Johannesburg.